On this special two-part episode, we sit down with playwright, entertainer, author, storyteller, and historian Mark Sebastian Jordan, who in the summer of 2021 released his book, The Ceely Rose Murders, at Malabar Farm. The book is about a young woman who in 1896 would gain notoriety for poisoning and killing her entire family. Mark sets the stage with the rich history of the famous farm, the Pleasant Valley area, and the incredible and sometimes horrific details about the life and crimes of Ceely Rose, including the media frenzied trial that would follow after her arrest. He even shares stories about the many ghosts who now reside there. The farm is located in Richland County, Ohio, which also lays home to the Ohio State Reformatory, the famous prison that was used as the set for Shawshank Redemption. Join us as we venture into the dark history of one of the most haunted places in America, known as Malabar Farm. My first question is, why were you so captured by this story?
Yeah, especially from a young age. And then, it's not like, oh, it started and then it just went away. It's like it stuck.
Mm-hmm. You talked about this, you learned it when you were 10, 11? 12, yeah.
12. Well, I was, from as far back as I can remember, I was interested in mysterious things, spooky, the macabre in general. And my mother recognized that about me. So in 1982, when I was 12, she noticed an article in the newspaper talking about hauntings in Ohio State parks. And she immediately knew that's something that I would be interested in. So she told me there was this article in the newspaper I should take a look at. And as I was already, rehearsing my sullen teenage years to come, I said, "What?" And she said,
"What?"
Yeah, she said, "No, trust me. This is your kind of thing. It's about ghosts in state parks." And I had to admit that interested me. She knew me too well. So I read it, and of course it led off with the story of Ceely Rose at Malabar Farm State Park. It's the most famous ghost story in any Ohio state park. And it really blew my mind to think that there's this famous story, a murder case of all things. And
in
it
your
happened,
backyard.
Yeah, in my backyard virtually. So that caught my interest. We had a school trip that went down to Malabar a few years after that.
I was mentioning that earlier. That was the field trip in this area was you go to Malabar. I remember doing that too.
Yeah. So I heard about it again there, and after that, once I was old enough to drive myself, I would drive down occasionally, take the tour, take along my little nieces and nephews, and take the wagon tour where they'd stop by the Rose farmhouse and tell the story. And it just fascinated me. I wasn't sure why, other than the fact that I had this taste for the macabre. But I started getting involved in theater in high school and in college. And after college, I was working at a mundane little job. And one day on my lunch break, I went to the bookstore at the Richland Mall in Ontario. Oh yeah, I was in there and I see a book called Haunted Ohio by Chris Woodyard. And it's ooh, well that sounds interesting. So I grabbed that, took it back, and instead of getting any actual work done that afternoon in the office, I kept reading that. This is so good.
Legit. I've read it, everybody here has read it, in this area that grew up in this area has read it. But if anybody's not read it, they're so pretty good. Legit.
Yeah.
They're
well, she collects great stories, but she also has a nice flair for writing about them. Well, chapter 2 of the first Haunted Ohio book retells the Ceely Rose story. And she didn't just take the version that was passed down from Louis Bromfield, who was the writer who started Malabar Farm. He told a version of the story in one of his books, Pleasant Valley, but his version isn't very accurate. He just based it on the hearsay he had heard from other people. He didn't go back and check original sources. Plus, he changed the names to protect the identities of people who were still living at that point. So it's a somewhat garbled version of the story. Well, Chris Woodyard went back, looked up some of the original newspaper articles, and that fascinated me. And the very day that I read that, I immediately saw that being done on stage as a historical drama. So that's when I decided to write it, and I wrote my first draft of it in 1 week of furious activity. And then I didn't have anywhere to perform it. So I sat on it for a couple years. I revised it, submitted it to a playwriting competition, got an honorable mention, and then I pretty much just threw it in a bottom drawer because, you know, it was an unproven, full-length new work by an unproven writer. So, you know,
Right,
the community
so-
theater didn't want to take a chance on it. Professional theaters weren't going to take a chance on it. So I was just prepared to forget it, pretty much. But a friend of mine, Dan Firetag, said, that thing is too cool for it to just sit in your bottom drawer. We're going to do that.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah. So I said, well, how are we going to do that? He said, well, what if you did it at Malabar? I was like, okay, well, maybe there would be a way to do it there. So I finally decided, what the heck, I would go down and talk with the park manager. The park manager at that time was Louis Andrus, and I'm glad he was the manager, because if it had been someone who was a little less willing to take a chance, the whole thing would have died there. We wouldn't be talking.
They're like,
Right.
oh, you want to do a play where and how?
I pitched all of this to Louis, and he said, well, what if you did it in the big barn here? There's a little built-in stage that we put in there for the barn dances for the band to play on. You could expand that. We could put chairs in there. We could even do it as a dinner theater, have a caterer prepare food.
That's smart, though.
Yeah, yeah. It was visionary. And we went and looked at the space, and as soon as I saw the space, I saw that, yes, it would be work to convert it into a full theatrical performance area, but I also saw that it could be done, and I knew that we could do it. And that was 2002 when we had that conversation, fall of 2003. We premiered my play, Ceely. We did that for 2 years, and then did a play I wrote about Mansfield eccentric Phoebe Wise for 2 years. Then brought Ceely back. Later on, did a play about Louis Bromfield himself for a couple of years. Invited someone else to do another play for a couple of years, and then finally came back. I think the last time we did it was 2015, where we did a production of Ceely again. So for over a decade, we ran that play out there to sell out crowds, and had a fantastic run with it. But all the while, I was thinking, okay, I created this version of it, a historical drama, but to tell it in that form, where I'm limited to less than 2 hours to cram that whole story in there, I had to condense things. I had to abridge characters.
you don't get
I
all
had
the
to
facts.
leave out people.
There's
Yeah,
so,
it's
when
very
I read the
limited.
book, I was like, there's so many characters, there's so many people, there's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
everybody got involved.
Right, yeah. Whereas in the play, I had to, condense those down to just 1 or 2 people. So I knew that I wanted someday to take all of that information and write a proper history of the case. It was something that was needed, and frankly, I was surprised that no one wrote a book about it before I did, because it's a pretty well-known case.
Right.
You do a Google search on Ceely Rose, and I do that every so often just to see where the story is getting to, and it's popping up now in languages I don't even recognize.
Can you kind of do a shortened story version of the story for
Sure.
those who may not know it?
Mm-hmm. It is a fascinating and tragic case. It took place in the late spring, early summer of 1896. There was a family that lived in a farmhouse on what is now the property of Malabar Farm State Park. This family came from southern Ohio originally, Pike County, moved up to Richland County in 1879, bought an old rundown mill because the father of the family, David Rose, had been a miller by trade. Now, his health was kind of shot because he had been in the Civil War and suffered some bad health issues during the war. So he wasn't able to work full time, but he was able to at least do some work and periodically have that mill running. His wife, Rebecca, she had been born Rebecca Easter, she contributed to the family's income by weaving rugs and selling those. The son of the family, Walter, did odd jobs, just day jobs for various farmers throughout the valley. In fact, he had what was called a huckster wagon. You know, he would go from farm to farm. If this guy, needed something, maybe he would give Walter a bunch of eggs in exchange for nails or something like that, and then Walter could use the eggs as a bargaining chip to barter with someone else, and he'd just make his rounds like that. The youngest member of the family was Ceely. Her name was spelled Celia, but Appalachian style was always pronounced Ceely. Today we'd probably call her Celia, but as far as I can tell, her name was always pronounced Ceely. Okay. So it's often rendered that way in information as Ceely. I use them interchangeably in the book, but it was always pronounced Ceely. And she was much younger than her brother Walter. In fact, in 1896, when all of these incidents take place, Ceely was 22, just about to turn 23. Her brother Walter was 39 years old. So a huge gap between them. We know that there was some tension both within the family. They were known to have tempers. And there was some tension between them and other people who lived in that valley there, which was known as Pleasant Valley. They had been regarded as outsiders to the valley because they moved into the area. And as far as I can tell by research, they didn't know anyone. So it took a long time for them to be accepted, and they were somewhat still regarded as outsiders. The hillbillies from southern Ohio who moved into the neighborhood, really.
I was born in southern Ohio, so they're not wrong.
My roots go back to eastern Kentucky, so I outhill y'all.
That's true. That's true.
So you had this, family with somewhat outsider status, but even within them, Ceely was even more of an outcast because it was clear as she grew up that she was slower than other kids, lagged way behind. The parents kept sending her to school until by the point when she was 20 years old, the teachers took a walk from the school down to the Rose farmhouse and said, "You really don't need to keep sending her. She's not going to learn anything more." Later on, one of her teachers estimated Ceely's mental age as being about that of a first grader. To give you an idea of Ceely's state of mind, one morning there was heavy rain in the valley, just a real heavy downpour. And Rebecca normally sent Ceely to walk up to the school from the Rose house, around the curve, up the bridge, up to the one-room schoolhouse is like a quarter of a mile.
That's the building. That's the building we saw.
We saw that.
Yeah,
we figured that's what that was.
Because we saw it and we're like, I think that's the schoolhouse because it's like right down the road from her house. So
so she only had that far to walk. Well, at the schoolhouse, the teacher notices that Ceely did not arrive that day. Now, normally, if Ceely was sick, Rebecca would flag down some other kid walking to school and tell the teacher, Ceely's not going to be in today, she's not feeling well. But nobody had heard anything from Rebecca. So at lunchtime, he sent one of the kids to run down to the Rose house and ask just to make sure she's okay. And Rebecca was startled. She had sent Ceely, but she never got to school. Well, everyone in the valley turned out to form a massive search party. They split up. Part of them went further down the valley. The other group went up the valley. The group going up the valley, and mind you, it was still raining this whole day. It was just one of those extended soaks. So the group that was going up the valley had gone about 5 miles up the valley. When up the road, they saw Ceely walking. And so they rushed to catch up with her and called out, finally got her attention. And when they got to her, they found that she was crying, she was weeping. She was so upset, so confused, because she kept walking and walking and walking, but never got to school. So that's the state of mind.
So she doesn't
of this person.
She doesn't even understand that she was lost at that
point.
Right?
Yeah. She completely did not grasp that. So we're talking about a not insignificant disability in her mental development. The kids in the valley called her Ceely Rose instead of Ceely because she was known to be very flighty, very giggly. And I get the impression that a lot of people thought she was kind of annoying because she was so giggly and silly. One time she visited a farmer's house with her mother, one of their neighbors, and the neighbor had just had wallpaper put in the living room of their house that had these big colorful flowers on them. And Ceely ran from flower to flower, kissing them and giggling at each one. And she's already like 18 or 19 when this happens, but it seems like something that a tiny child would do. At school, she would play with the little kids on the playground. If some of the boys were playing ball, she would cheer, but she would cheer for both teams. She just liked cheering. It didn't really matter.
It didn't matter
to her, for who it was. It's just, yay. She liked jumping up and down and shouting. So that's kind of the nature of her. But here she is developing, growing up, becoming a young woman with all of the hormones of a fully grown adult and trying to control that with what was essentially a child's mind. Well, they started saying things like Ceely's boy crazy. She's getting crushes on everyone. She had a crush on a local farmer who just laughed in her face when she came up and told him how wonderful she thought he was. So she decided to try someone else. She developed a crush on Clem Herring, who was a farmer who lived just up the road from the Roses. And Clem just tried to ignore her completely, not laugh in her face, but not encourage her either. So she actually started doing things like stealing his mail just to try to get his attention.
Because then you gotta come get it.
Yeah. But he didn't give any response, and she got in trouble for stealing things. So she hit upon a new fixation somewhere around the winter of 1895 into 1896. She started fixating on Guy Barry. He was a young man who lived in the farm next door to the Roses. He was 16 years old at the time, handsome blonde-haired boy, and she just thought he was amazing. Now, of course, at this point, she's 22 years old, but nonetheless, she looks up to him because from her point of view, he's to be looked up to. He's older. He's popular, he's smart, he's handsome. So she really, really looks up to him. That's a matter right off the bat. That's a matter of some tension because those two families did not get along. There had been an incident. I was not able to find out any detail about it, but there had been some kind of falling out between the Roses and Barrys in years past, so they would not even say hello to each other.
Which is interesting considering they're all buried in a cemetery together now.
Right.
Well,
they're still not saying hi to each other there.
That's true.
Couldn't the houses, you could see both houses from each other.
Yeah,
they're that close
they're
together.
Almost a stone's throw.
Yeah, I was like, if all those trees, because we were there, I was like, if all those trees weren't there, you could see, you could see it.
And that's what Ceely did. She looked over and, she would stand in the window watching to see Guy in the house. When he went out to the field, she'd watch him. Then she'd go out and follow him, start to talk with him. And as far as we can figure from what surviving information is there, it appears that Guy Barry felt sorry for Ceely and tried to, at least be nice to her. Not laugh in her face, but not ignore her either. Just try to be polite. If she wanted to talk to him, okay, he'd answer her questions. He'd be nice. Well, she had never gotten that kind of attention.
So to her it was
So she thought, this is it. This is the one. He's the one. We're going to get married. We're going to have our own house. I get to be the ma of my own house. Then I'll be the boss. Because Rebecca was even though David was infamous for his temper, it was clear that Rebecca was the rock of the family, that everything sort of revolved around. So she's making up stories in her mind of living happily ever after with Guy. And before long, that has crossed over from her own thoughts into what she's saying to other people. She starts going around saying, Guy Barry and I are going to get married. we're going to have kids, and we're going to have a house, and all this kind of stuff.
Which I'm sure in her mind, like, she's like, that's a genuine, real truth that, like, she does think it. Like, she's, in her mind, she's not lying. She's not telling any false information.
Yeah,
she thinks
she's just saying,
true.
this is what's going to happen. She starts spreading this around. Well, George Barry, Guy Barry's father, hears this comes back to him, and he's furious because he doesn't want anyone thinking that one of his sons is going to marry a girl like that. You know, back in those days, they had such severe terms for it. It's disturbing when you're reading information from the trial and all these doctors are trying to decide whether Ceely Rose should properly be diagnosed as an idiot, an imbecile, or a moron.
Yeah.
That's the kind of words
People's
they
reaction,
used in those days.
Back then were so much different. Like, for me personally, that's one thing I've always been wondered, and part of my mind is I was born with epilepsy, like very severe seizures, and everything I've heard about people, who have knowledge about history is people that had seizure disorders were the type of people that they're like, she's a witch.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I would have gotten burned.
Send them off to the state hospital.
Right, something
or
like
possessed.
that. Right. That was they were associating possession with being a witch. So yes, like I'd go to the state hospital or I would be burned at the stake. So it makes me really happy that I'm like not alive then.
Yeah. Yes. So George Barry was furious. Guy was frustrated because she's going around saying all of these things, which embarrasses him. So George Barry, I actually finally tracked it down to the day. It must have been June the 5th, 1896. He got mad and he marched from his house down to the mill that Ceely's father operated and gave him a piece of his mind. He basically said to him, get your daughter under control, stop her from spreading these lies, or we're going to have real trouble, mister. So, of course, David came down on Ceely really hard, and he said, you are in serious trouble now because you've been doing this. Well, Ceely's first panic is, oh no, he's going to tell Ma. And so as he's yelling at her saying, you've got to forget about Guy Barry, don't bug him anymore, don't stand at the window watching him, don't even bring up his name anymore. All the time she's thinking, don't tell Ma, don't tell Ma. I'll do anything if you promise not to tell Ma, because Ma is the real power of the family. And so, of course, after she's agreed to that, he immediately tells Rebecca. So she's in trouble, even worse now, all over again. And then Walter is so much older than her. He's kind of like another parent, too. So then he's yelling at her as well. So she's got 3 hot-tempered people breathing down her neck about this.
Don't talk to this person. And you can literally see their house outside the window.
Right. And they're just saying, drop it. Absolutely don't even bring up his name again. And she agreed. She said, okay, I won't. I'll behave. And she appeared to toe the line and acquiesce. But we now know that she did not do that. What happened at this point in early June of 1896 is that she took 2 pieces of information. She had heard from March through May of that year, there was a famous murder case in the newspaper that happened up around the Akron area involving a farmhand who had allegedly beat a farmer and his wife to death, plus their hired man, with a baseball bat so that he could run off with the daughter of that family. It was all over the news, and Ceely heard her parents discuss this at the breakfast table. And she was fascinated by this story, and she didn't really understand, well, why would he do that? And they explained it to her, well, he was in love with the farmer's daughter, so he was just trying to get them out of the way so they could run off.
Now she's thinking that's an option.
So she's got that idea in her head now. Well, and this is the part that fascinates me, because for society to function, you've got the majority of people who are commonly thought of as being sane, in as much as they really are. I think we all know people who are maybe a little questionable in that category. But the majority of people are thought of as sane, and there's some people that we definitely think are insane. So there's a border where those two conditions meet. And that border is exactly where Ceely Rose sits. Because, yes, it's clear from these descriptions of her behavior that she was what we would today call developmentally disabled. She lagged well behind other children and had great trouble doing a lot of the more advanced mental functions that a person needs to do as they grow up. But yet, she was able to take that piece of information she had heard about this murder case up around Akron and put it together with another piece of information that her parents had drilled into her. They said, we keep some rough-on rats around here to keep, control on rats and mice out in the mill, and, use it to keep potato bugs from getting bad in the vegetable garden. And they told her, whatever you do, don't mess with that stuff. Even just a little bit of that stuff could kill a person. So her mental condition may have been slow, but she had the time to brood, take those two pieces of information, and put them together. She made a plan, and on the morning of June 24th, 1896, she executed her plan. She fetched the cottage cheese that was going to be part of the family's breakfast that morning, and she took a spoonful of rough-on rats, rat poison, which contains a huge portion of arsenic.
I was going to say, a spoonful's probably more than she even needed.
Yeah, right. And she stirred that into the cottage cheese, took it in, served it to the family for breakfast. David, the father, was very hungry that morning. He ate 2 helpings of it. Walter ate a bowl. Rebecca was feeling a little bit under the weather, had a bit of a headache, so she only ate a little bit that morning. Then they all prepared to go about their days. Of course, it's one of those little telling details that they offered Ceely, don't you want some of the cottage cheese? And she put some on her plate, but she never ate any of it. So they all prepare to go about their business for the day. David headed over to the mill to get working on an order over there. Walter headed up onto Ferguson Ridge because he had heard a rumor that there were some black raspberries which were ripe, ready for picking. And Rebecca got ready to start weaving for the day. But before she set up her loom, she noticed that she had come down with a terrible thirst. And so she said to Ceely, would you get me some water? Ceely got her some water. Rebecca drank the water and immediately violently threw up, and her stomach went into severe cramps. The pain was so severe, it actually caused her to fall down on the floor, and she couldn't get back up. She kept throwing up more. She realized it was bad, so she told Ceely to go get her father. Ceely ran out to the mill, got David. He came in, saw the condition Rebecca was in, helped her into a chair, and he said, I'm going to go get the doctor. Well, their regular family doctor was out of town, but he knew that there was a new doctor over in the village of Newville. So he hitched up the wagon and headed across the ridge to Newville to find this doctor. That is an important detail of the case because older rural physicians in the late 1800s did not always catch the signs of poisoning because it's, of course, similar to food poisoning. There are certain illnesses that have very similar symptoms. Young doctors in the late 1800s were increasingly being trained to watch out for the signs of potential arsenic or strychnine poisoning so that it could be caught, because it was quite the popular way to kill people in those days because it was fairly easy to get those poisons and not easy for it to be detected. So young doctors were being trained, look for these signs, look for these signs. Well, it just so happens that since the regular doctor, an older doctor, wasn't in town, David Rose had to go for this young doctor over in Newville named Dr. McCombs, who had this kind of training. So when he comes over there and, well, he starts coming back, but along the way, David realizes he's suffering from this terrible thirst. Can we stop at this farm and let me get a little water? They got a pump out here in the yard. You know what happens next. He takes a drink of water, throws it up, and his stomach goes into painful cramping. The doctor gets David back on the wagon. They continue back toward the Rose Farm. They must have at some point passed Walter, who was either making his way back to the road or had already collapsed in the ditch and wasn't seen laying there. Because once the doctor has David back, a neighbor runs in saying, "Hey, we just found Walter up the road, up Ferguson Way. He was in the ditch and he don't look too good." So the doctor rushes back up there, gets him, brings him back. They're all suffering from this vomiting, terrible cramps. And when you have massive arsenical poisoning, it's not just the stomach. Almost every muscle in your body starts cramping with this. It's actually one of the most horrific ways to die.
Yeah, that sounds terrible.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It is. You know, sometimes people think like, oh, stabbing or shooting, it's so bloody, it's gory. Yeah, but they're relatively quick usually. Poisoning by some kind of heavy metal is excruciating, and it takes a while. In David's case, he lasted for about a day before he died. So that's a day of pure agony. But he was the lucky one. Walter lasted for 7 days. 7 days where he can't take in any water, he can't take in any food. So not only is he suffering from this massive cramping, he's also dehydrating, losing all the water. Eyewitness account said that his lips turned black from the dryness. A neighbor actually sent down her daughter with a little jar of salve to put on his lips just to try and ease his pain. Well, after 7 days, he died. At that point, the Richland County Sheriff and the prosecutor have come in and have started investigating the situation. And as they're looking at everything, the doctor has already told them, I think this is severe. I think this is poisoning. This is not some natural or accidental poisoning. And he pointed out that, of course, through all of it, Ceely's just standing there watching it all in fascination. They asked her if she had eaten food that morning, did she feel sick? And she said, "Oh yes, I feel sick." But she was just standing there watching it all, watching what she had created and being fascinated by all of it. So the investigation begins, but as the prosecutor and the sheriff start questioning the family, they're having trouble getting any useful information. They have a formal inquest at the old schoolhouse and ask a bunch of questions there, and they're startled to realize when they ask Ceely a question, every time they ask Ceely a question, she looks first at her mother. Her mother encourages her, and she starts giving a carefully rehearsed answer word for word. Then she looks at her mother to make sure she did it right. Rebecca nods again. They ask the same question from different angles. They get the recited answer over and over again. So they realize at this point, Rebecca, it's one of two things. Either Rebecca is actually the one who made her do these things, or else she has identified that her daughter has done this, but also realizes she's not fully understanding of what she has done.
So
she's trying to protect her. She's trying to cover her and protect her because she knows they'll take her off to prison if she's found guilty of this. And that was a very risky decision on her part.
Obviously, yeah.
What ended up happening is that Ceely poisoned her a second time. And in fact, that second poisoning did not happen until the evening after the doctor told Rebecca, and this is almost a month after the initial poisonings. She's, for a period of a month, Ceely's been taking care of her and actually doing a good job of it, kind of slowly nursing her back to health. But a month after the initial poisoning, the doctor says to Rebecca, "You're going to survive. It's going to be a gradual thing, but you will get back to full strength. This is not going to end your life. You are going to survive." That evening, Ceely poisoned her a second time. And the second time, the first time she had put a spoonful of Rough on Rats in a bowl of cottage cheese. The second time she puts 2 spoonfuls in 1 cup of buttermilk that she serves to her mother. Her mother only lasted a few hours after that. By this point, after the third death, everyone in the valley is in an uproar. Why aren't they doing something?
Yeah,
Are they just going to
know.
let her? And word had gotten around too. There were other incidents as well. And this is one that fascinates me. One morning, George Barry and his wife hear a knock at the door. They go to the door and they find it's Ceely. She's holding a pie. She says, "This pie is for you and Mrs. Barry, but Guy's not allowed to eat any of this pie, all right?" So they take the pie from her, say, "Gee, thanks." And as soon as she'd gone, they throw the pie into their backyard. They're not going to touch a pie that Ceely Rose baked. Later that afternoon, they look out into the backyard. They see the remains of the pie there. And it has lots of these triangular little peck marks in it. And as they look around the yard, they see all of their chickens lying dead across the yard. She also prepared a special recipe chicken that she baked in the oven because, she had all of this time to herself. She could practice her cooking skills. Yeah. She prepared a chicken for Pastor Kramer from the Pleasant Valley Lutheran Church, who normally stopped by every week to see how Rebecca was doing. But by some coincidence, that particular week, he had to check on another sick parishioner, so he never made it there and didn't get his special treat. Well, she killed her father and her brother in one incident, killed her mother in another incident, attempted to poison the Barrys, attempted to poison Pastor Kramer. There is a word for a person who does this in multiple incidences, or a compound word, and that is, of course, serial killer.
Right.
One of the reasons this case is so fascinating is, to my knowledge, she's unique in being the only known case of a developmentally disabled, violent psychotic who becomes a serial killer.
And is also a woman.
And a woman to boot, right.
It's not very common for a woman.
Right, there's so many unusual features to this case. I'm actually frankly surprised it's not more famous with all of these elements going on.
I don't know, I feel like sometimes though, the whole ideal that Malabar Farm is haunted and people, want that aspect of it kind of covers up the actual, there's history here and there's a story.
Right. There's an incredible story underneath that. The haunting aspect is a fascinating thing, and I intend to write a book about that. I want to collect those stories because I already have a lot of them, like to get more of them. But I also decided early on, I want that to be a separate book because the pure history of it is startling and fascinating, and it needs a little attention on its own right. And so I decided to do those as two separate things. So the county sheriff and the Richland County prosecutor, Gus Douglas, at this point, they are incredibly frustrated because they can't get Ceely to confess. They can't find any evidence. They tore up the house. They tore up the mill. They couldn't find any poison that she used. There were theories, okay, what did she do? Maybe soak fly paper to get the arsenic out of it? Did she use rat poison? They didn't know. They couldn't find any proof. And this is largely the age before forensics. The only forensic test that they had to use was the Marsh test, which is the test that proved they did die of massive arsenical poisoning. So they did have that. That was their one.
Do you know what the Marsh test, all that entails?
I've read the details of it off the top of my head.
Okay, I was curious.
I don't recall. Yeah, it's it's something about a chemical reaction that creates a residue of metallic arsenic, and that's how they identify
like with the organ tissue there. And stuff.
Yeah. It's they tested the stomach linings to find that. So you had those elements of it there, but it was at best a circumstantial case against her, and they were very aware of the fact that since this was poisoning, that automatically presupposes planning, which means premeditated murder in the first degree. And you have to have your ducks in a row to prove that. And they knew they didn't have it. That's why they had hesitated so long. And that ended up costing Rebecca Rose her life. But they knew they couldn't let this go on indefinitely because she was dangerous.
And she's probably going to do it again.
Very possible.
Yeah.
So they finally came up with an idea where they had a friend of Ceely's go and spend time with her. They said, go and stay with her a few days, because she had been taken in by another farm family up the road, a farm family that didn't think she could actually be guilty of the crime. I mean, come on, giggly Ceely Rose, she couldn't do something like that. So they took her in, and so they said, go stay with Ceely for a few days and just talk with her. Just be friends with her, take walks with her, chat with her. And after you've got her talking about things, say to her, Ceely, I need some advice. I've fallen in love with a man, but my parents don't want me to see him. And then ask her for advice. They probably,
it's too perfect.
They probably also told her to not accept it if she offers you anything to eat.
I'm sure. I was thinking about that in the back of my mind when we were talking. I was like, I really hope they told her not to eat anything that she made.
This friend of Ceely's, whose name was Tracy Davis, spent some time with Ceely, and one day they were taking a walk, and that's when Tracy asked the question. And Ceely gave her a long, hard look, and she said, let me think about it, and dropped it there. So they came back around to it in conversation the next day, and Ceely said, well, that question you're asking me about the other day, what I would do is I would kill them. That's what I did. And she proceeded to give a detailed explanation of how she had poisoned her family. And this, was what Tracy expected, although I kind of get the feeling that she had hoped against hope that maybe Ceely hadn't actually done it. But that finally confirmed it. So she made her excuse and left soon after that, went home, told her father, and they went and told the prosecutor what Ceely had confessed to. Prosecutor said, okay, that's great. Now we've got to get her to confess again, because we can't just go by what you say, because that's just hearsay.
Right.
So they have to have another witness. But then I got this incredible warm and cold feeling at the same time. So I think I got hugged by a ghost.
I was going to say, that's kind of